Thank you everyone for joining. It's another week and it's Wednesday night. We go through the very special messages of the Torah of this week. First, we'll start with a summary as we do every time, and then we're going to go on to the insights and the thoughts that we could take with us from this Shabbat's reading. Let's go through the summary. Hashem commands the Jewish people to use the purest of olive oils for the daily kindling of the Menorah. So let's wind back. Last week we spoke about many vessels of the sanctuary. For example, we spoke about the ark, which housed the tablets. We spoke about the menorah, which was kindled every single day. We spoke about the table that housed the loaves of bread that were kept fresh from one week to another miraculously, and then fed the Kohanim on duty that week. We also spoke about the outer altar, which was made of copper rather than of gold. The other items were made of gold, covered over the wood. And the outer altar was made out of copper. So this week in general, we're talking about clothing. What did the Kohanim wear? And we're going to see pictures that I've loaded up just to show you can actually see what it looks like. But before telling us about the clothing, the first commandment, as we just said, was what to use the menorah for. The menorah that we learned about last week, how it was constructed. So we start this week's portion by how it was lit every single evening. And it remained lit until the morning time, and then each evening it was relit, and it had to be made from the purest of oil. Secondly, Moshe is instructed to consecrate Aaron and his sons by dressing them in special bigdei kahuna, clothing that was appropriate for the Kohanim. And that's what we're going to learn about for most of this week's portion. The first of the variety of clothing that was specific to the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, was an ephod, which was a reversed apron. We'll show you diagrams as best as we can understand from the verses, which covered the back and tied in front. So it was the opposite of an apron. Apron, normally it covers in front and you tied at the back. This one came from the back and was tied in front. Then on that was a precious stone-studded shoulder straps. Then there was the Choshen Mishpat, which was the breastplate that gave judgment, because they actually miraculously communicated with Hashem, who would answer questions by lighting up the various letters that were engraved next to these 12 precious stones, representing 12 tribes, the names of the tribes, and Hashem would actually communicate by this miraculous interaction between God and man through this breastplate. There were 4 rows of precious stones. Each row had 3 stones. 4 times 3 was 12, representing the 12 tribes. Then artisans engraved the names of the 12 tribes onto these 12 stones. The cloth breastplate contained a fold. So you had these metal, gold, which had these stones, precious stones, that were set into it. But that itself was placed on a material breastplate that was in front on the chest, which had a fold in it. And into that fold was placed a parchment on which was written the ineffable name of God, how it is never normally pronounced. It was the long 70-lettered name of Hashem, and that was placed in. And when the name of God was placed inside the fold of the material behind this gold breastplate, then it had this miraculous ability to communicate the message of Hashem to the Jewish people by different letters lighting up and giving answers that way. The Choshen Mishpat was then secured by straps which connected it to the ephod. So we now got a connection between the breastplate and the reverse apron, which we spoke about. And with us, we've got 2 of the special clothing worn by the Kohen Gadol, only the high priest. I'll show you pictures of it soon. Then the third of the special clothing items that was worn by the high Kohen Gadol was a ma'il. It was a blue robe. It was actually a very long piece of material, blue, that had a hole in the middle, which went over the head of the Kohen Gadol. So you now had the front and the back, almost like a talit katan, like a small talis katan that we wear underneath our shirts. A hole in it goes over our heads, and then you have the front and the back. It was blue, and it was adorned with golden bells and cloth pomegranates. I'm going to show you pictures of it now. The third of the special garments worn specifically by the high priest, by the Kohen Gadol, was the tzitz. It was a plate that was worn across his forehead, gold, and into that plate was engraved the words Kodesh LaHashem or LaHashem Kodesh, holy to God. So you have the backward apron, you have the breastplate, that's two, you have the me'il, which is this blue robe, and then you have the tzitz, which is a plate across his forehead made of gold. Those are four items only Aaron, when he served as Kohen Gadol, and any subsequent high priest wore. Now the regular priests, including also the Kohen Gadol, in addition to these four, had four basic pieces of clothing. And those four garments worn by a high priest and every regular priest was a tunic, a turban, the sashes, which is like a long belt, and a pair of pants. So we're going to see pictures of that too. So every Kohen wore these four things. Pants, more is like a judo suit, white pants, a white jacket, a belt, and a turban around his head. The procedure of consecrating Aaron and his sons as Kohanim is listed. Aaron and his sons immersed in a mikveh, then they were dressed in their priestly garments in the big day Kohanah. Moshe Rabbeinu offered various inaugural sacrifices on their behalf. The inaugural service was to be repeated for 7 days. So it was 7 days they constantly did these inaugural acts of service to initiate the practice in the Mishkan. And then finally everything was dedicated. Then it says that there were 2 burnt offerings which were brought daily for perpetuity, 1 lamb in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. They parallel 2 of our prayers that we do every day, Shachris in the morning, Mincha in the afternoon. That's how we start the day, that's how we end the day. Every single day, these 2 burnt offerings were brought. Why are they called burnt offerings? Because they were completely consumed on the outer altar. And this was every day. Monday, Tuesday, Shabbos. Normally, you don't do elective sacrifices on Shabbos, but this was done on Shabbos too. Yom Kippur, which had so much that filled the day of Yom Kippur, still had the 2 burnt offerings, 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening. Hashem promises that he's going to dwell in the Mishkan of Hashem. And then finally, and it looks like it's totally out of place, so hopefully we'll have time to address this, we have, after all the clothing and the inaugural activities to dedicate and get the Kohanim ready to do their practice, we suddenly say, whoops, there's an additional vessel. And that is the golden altar. The copper altar stood outside, and that's where the sacrifices were burnt. But there was also a golden altar. And that golden altar was where they burnt the incense. That was placed inside the sanctuary, next to the menorah, next to the table that we dealt with last week. So the obvious question is, why is this vessel dealt with in this week's portion and not in last week's portion where we dealt with all the vessels? It's like one vessel that was left over and then put right at the tail end. Hopefully we'll have enough time to address that question too. So we got a lot of technical details, but let's just go through some of the pictures that depict the clothing. On my right over here, you have the clothing that was external, worn on top of the other 4. So let's start the other way. Let's look at the left-hand side. Every Kohen had these 4 garments. It was a turban, which was a hat that went on his head. There was a white tunic, like a long judo jacket. And underneath that were Bermuda shorts or pants. It went maybe towards the knee, and they were white. So every Kohen had 1, the pants, 2, the jacket, long jacket, a belt that wound around his waist, that's 3, and a headgear, which is 4. So every Kohen had that, including the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, who had it. Over these 4, now comes his 4, additional 4. So every Kohen wore these 4 garments, and the Kohen Gadol wore 8, because he wore these 4 plus what? Over here we see there's an ephod. I'm going to show you more clear diagrams in the next picture. So this was, you can see the flap over here, a backward apron that wrapped around the back of him and tied in front. And then there was the breastplate with shoulder straps. There was the blue cloak that went over the white one, which was called the me'il. And then there was a tzitz which went across his forehead. Let's get more specific pictures of each of these. Here you got the backward apron, more clearly depicted. So the Kohen had this wrapped from his one hip all the way around the back to his other hip, tied across his waist, with shoulder straps that came up over his shoulder, and they were then attached to the top of the breastplate, which is the second item we're talking about. The bottom of the breastplate, again, also was attached to the belt part of the backward apron. And that then gave you, number one and number two, over the four garments that we said every Kohen wore were these garments. Then on top of underneath this apron was a me'il, which is this blue long tunic, which had a hole in the top of it and was over the head, and it had these bells that were made of bells and pomegranates made of material. So these were all around the, this is on top of the Kohen. So the Kohen had 1, 2, 3, and this is now, I don't know why I can't, let's just see if we can get rid of this. Yeah, there we can get rid of it. We had this band across his forehead, which said, La Hashem Kodesh Le Hashem, or Hashem Kodesh Le, different versions how it was, but it was a copper plate that went around his forehead, and then it tied over the back of his hat so that it kept on his forehead and remained there all the time. This little part of the diagram just shows how the white tunic, the white coat, had a pattern in it that was looked like little squares, little engraved in. So it was material that had this fabric that was formed in this way. So these are all pictures that are trying to describe the various clothing. So here you have more specifically each one. That's the backward apron, the ephod. This is the breastplate, a little bit more clearly depicted. This is the me'il with bells and material pomegranates between the bells. And then you had the plate that went across his forehead. I hope the pictures describe a little bit more clearly what was going on. This is the box-like knit of the tunic itself. Let's move on to the messages we can derive from such a technical section. And I'd like to start off with the title that I gave to the shir, which was that sometimes an omission can be very revealing. And the Baal HaTurim was actually one of the commentaries, beautiful commentaries on Chumash, often giving very deep insight into the words of the Chumash, but also happened to be an author of great halachic works of the Torah, the Baal HaTurim. And he draws attention to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu's name does not appear in this week's portion. And that is significant, because in the book of Breshit, the book of Genesis, true, we don't have Moshe Rabbeinu's name mentioned once. Well, he wasn't born yet. But from the book of Shemot, of Exodus, Moshe Rabbeinu is born, and every single portion, all the way through to the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, there are a few exceptional omission portions of the Torah that don't have Moshe Rabbeinu's name. But in the book of Deuteronomy, the whole book of Deuteronomy is said by Moshe Rabbeinu. It starts off, and Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the Jewish people, and the whole book is one long presentation from Moshe Rabbeinu. So his absence there is actually not seen as any omission, because Moshe Rabbeinu is talking. He is the subject talking to the Jewish people throughout the whole book of Deuteronomy. But the book of Shemot, Exodus, Vayikra, Leviticus, Bamidbar, Numbers, those three books are the story, what happened to the Jewish people as presented in the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu is mentioned in every single portion except this week. The Baal HaTurim says that the reason is touching on a halachic, a principle of Jewish law. And what is that? That in next week's portion, we deal with the dance around the golden calf. Hashem was ready to eradicate, God forbid, the entire Jewish people because of their dance around the golden calf. Moshe Rabbeinu intervenes and he says to Hashem, forgive the Jewish people. Please, Hashem, forgive this people. And if you do not, wipe me out of this book that you have written. Take me out. I don't want to be a part of the Torah if you, Hashem, cannot find place to forgive the Jewish people. And even though, says the Baal HaTurim, that Hashem did forgive the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu said, if you don't forgive the Jewish people, take my name out of the Torah. Hashem did forgive the Jewish people. But every utterance of a tzaddik, when a righteous person says the words, wipe me out of the Torah, even though it was if, in the event that you don't forgive, and Hashem did forgive, but the fact that those words came off his lips meant that Hashem was going to take away Moshe Rabbeinu's name from at least a part of the Torah. And so Hashem waited, because it's next week that this whole discussion takes place. So Hashem waits for the whole cycle to go by. From next week, every single portion of the Torah back to this week's portion, which is 1 week before the discussion. It's like the whole cycle later, and Hashem takes Moshe Rabbeinu's name out of this week's portion. So, in a very, very technical interaction between Moshe Rabbeinu and Hashem, where Moshe Rabbeinu says, if you do not forgive the Jewish people, take my name out of the Torah. Hashem says, that's it. You said the words, your name is going to be taken out of the Torah. Not out of the entire Torah, but out of a place where it would otherwise have appeared, the portion of Tetzaveh, the last opportunity. I waited for the very last week before we've completed the whole cycle from that discussion, which is this Shabbat. And so Moshe Rabbeinu's name doesn't appear. And it can be very heartbreaking to think about this technicality of removing Moshe Rabbeinu's name, because we know how much the Torah meant to Moshe Rabbeinu. He was the one that went up the mountain, spent 40 days, 40 nights, speaking to Hashem, praying, comes down with the tablets. This was Moshe Rabbeinu's life. He is Moshe Rabbeinu the teacher of what? Of the Torah. And Moshe Rabbeinu's name is taken out because of a technicality. You said the words, Moshe, out your name goes. So that's on a level that the Baal HaTurim explains why Moshe Rabbeinu's name does not appear this week. I want to give an insight from the teachings of Chassidut, which always touches on the mystical teachings of the Torah and gives us such a deep insight into this whole process. Because the Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic, the esoteric, the mystical approach to this whole story gives us a much deeper insight. And that is what? Ironically, Moshe Rabbeinu's name does not appear in this week's Torah portion, but Moshe Rabbeinu is referred to in the very first word of this week's portion. What's the first week's of the word? What's the first word of this week's portion? Ve'ata, and you, Tetzaveh, command the Jewish people to bring pure olive oil, which will be used in the Menorah. Who's the you? Who's the you pronoun referring to? Moshe Rabbeinu. So the mystical teaching says it's true that the name of Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't appear, but look what happens over here. The only portion that refers to Moshe Rabbeinu in the first word of the portion is this week, albeit not by name, but by the pronoun and you. And who's the you referring to? Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, what's the difference between a pronoun and a name? Well, a name is a manifestation of self. Names are very important. That's why if God forbid somebody ill, we mention the name. If one wants to resuscitate somebody who's fainted, you say the name. The name digs very deeply into the inner psyche, into the inner being of a human being. But a pronoun, you, actually touches a deeper sense of that person's essence. And the proof is that when God talks to us in the 10 Commandments, the first commandment, which is you shall believe in me, what's the first word of the 10 Commandments? Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God. Lord your God are names, and they manifest different attributes and expressions and mediums of communication that God uses. But the first word of the 10 Commandments is Anochi, I. That is the essence of God. That is beyond any depiction in any name. And that is a proof that the pronoun, I, in that case, is the essence of God, beyond name, higher than name, deeper than name, the very essence itself. And likewise, the irony of this week's portion is that the name of Moshe Rabbeinu is not there, not even once, but Moshe Rabbeinu, V'ata Tetzaveh, and you command the Jewish people, you. Who's the you? Moshe Rabbeinu. And the pronoun depicts the essence of a person even more than a name can. A name is how I call you. I need a name, a handle to call you. But the pronoun goes to the very essence. So the irony is that this week we don't have Moshe Rabbeinu's name, but we have Moshe Rabbeinu in the absolute first word of this week's portion. And how do we explain that? Still holding on to the Baal HaTurim, who gives this wonderful commentary about Moshe Rabbeinu's name being taken out. Because if we ask ourselves, what was the finest moment that depicts the absolute essence of Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership, and leadership in its absolute pristine form, leadership? What event in Moshe Rabbeinu's life depicted who Moshe Rabbeinu was more than any other? And we could argue it was when he stood on the mountain and he had the 10 Commandments in his hand. We could argue that it was when he split the sea or when he brought the plagues on Egypt. Great miraculous moments. But mystically, what are we saying? You want to know who Moshe Rabbeinu was? The essence of Moshe Rabbeinu was in the moment when he turned to God and he said, Hashem, I love your Torah so much. Your Torah means everything to me. That's why I wake up in the morning. My essence is connected to your Torah. But if you can't forgive the Jewish people, I am Moshe only because I have a people to serve. And if you cannot forgive the Jewish people and you're going to eradicate the Jewish people, I have no place in your Torah because my essence is connected to my people. And it's not about me and my fame, as the commentaries say that Hashem actually said to Moshe Rabbeinu, I'll get rid of the Jewish people and I'll build a new people from you, Moshe. We'll take a new beginning. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't looking for fame and fortune. He wasn't looking for his name to be immortalized. Moshe Rabbeinu was looking to serve his people. And he says to Hashem, my people, my flock, if you, Hashem, take away my flock, I am nothing. I have nothing. I live to serve my people. That is the ultimate expression of leadership. Leadership isn't putting on airs and being recognized and getting the man of the moment and the man of the match and being noticed and being celebrated in public and getting all the awards that we normally associate with leadership. Leadership today, political leadership, is all about me. It's about how much I'm noticed and what are my ratings and how am I able to get more and more noticed on Facebook, on public media, to the point that it's to the detriment of the people we're serving. Politicians get up and promise all that they promise that they're going to take care of in the next 4 years, and the moment that they're elected, their attention turns onto themselves. By stark contrast, Moshe Rabbeinu teaches what leadership is. Leadership is not about me. It's not about who the individual is that is singled out for importance. It's about serving the needs of the flock. From the first moment Moshe Rabbeinu was picked, we mentioned it a few weeks ago, Hashem saw him run after that lost sheep. And he ran and ran. Eventually the sheep needed water. He saw the sheep was thirsty. And he picked up the sheep and he said, I'm sorry, my dear little shepherd. I didn't realize you were thirsty. And he tended to that one individual. He gave of himself. And Hashem said, that's the attribute. setting self aside for the needs of people, that's leadership. So the irony is that Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not here, but which is the one portion in the Torah, more than any other, that mentions Moshe Rabbeinu in the first word this week, the week when his name is absent, because this is the week that tells us who Moshe Rabbeinu really is. We want to have an insight into Moshe Rabbeinu. This is the week when his name is erased because of his care for his people. This is the week that Ba'ato, you Moshe Rabbeinu, the essence of you is expressed. So powerfully, the mystical teachings of Hasidus takes a technicality of law. You said the words, Moshe, so now we have to deliver, even though you said it on condition, but you, Tzaddik, said the words, write me out, your name has to go out. Too bad. Comes the mystical teachings and says, yes, Moshe Rabbeinu's name was eradicated because he said, wipe me out. But the pronoun you, Moshe Rabbeinu, is in the first word because this is the portion that tells us more than any other who Moshe Rabbeinu was as a leader. He sacrificed and was ready to sacrifice his all, his very being, his presence in the Torah that he gave his life for. Because there was one thing more important, and that was serving his people. What a beautiful message for all of us, and every one of us is in some way a leader of our group at work or of ourselves, our family, our very own self. What does it take to be a leader? We think leadership is being lauded for our successes, noticed, what people think about us. We think that that's what makes us a leader. What makes us a leader is when we're ready to give up everything of self for the needs of our people. What a beautiful message of Moshe Rabbeinu's name not being here and very much being here, which is what these first two slides are all about. The word Tetzaveh, which we translate commonly as to command, and in this case, and you, Moshe Rabbeinu, you command the Jewish people to bring pure olive oil to light the menorah. The word Tetzaveh has a source that comes from the word tzavta, which really means chibur, which means connection. The word Tetzaveh, and you command, also means, and you, Moshe Rabbeinu, will connect, and you shall bond. So says the Or HaChaim HaKodesh, one of the classic commentaries of the Torah. The verse can also be read as follows. Hashem was saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, and you, Moshe Rabbeinu, bond, not just command. Tetzaveh means command, but Tetzaveh also means bond. You shall bond with the Jewish people. For every Jewish soul has at its core the spark of the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu was this connecting force that brought Jews together and connected Jews to Hashem. He was the glue that held us together. There was a part of Moshe Rabbeinu, there's a part of Moshe Rabbeinu in every generation and in every single person of the Jewish people within the generation. So we actually have the role of Moshe Rabbeinu, one word after the va'ata, and you what? Tetzaveh, this essence of Moshe Rabbeinu connects Hashem to the Jewish people. Look how he said, Hashem, look after your Jewish people, even if my name will be wiped out. He connected Am Yisrael to Hashem. That is the role of Moshe Rabbeinu and his leadership. What did they have to do? What was the command? Or what was this point of connection? They had to bring pure olive oil to raise an everlasting lamp from evening until morning. So this verse actually contains a paradox, because on the one hand it says that it'll be everlasting, that it'll always burn, and ner tamid. We replicate this in the shul when we have a red lamp over the Aron HaKodesh, which represents the fire, the flame of the menorah that burnt all the time. So you have a ner tamid, an everlasting lamp. You also had an eish tamid, a fire that was everlasting. But over here, after telling us it's everlasting, it says me'erev ad boker, from evening to morning. So was it everlasting, or did it relate to certain times and timings within the day? So everlasting flame implies a state of perpetuity and changelessness. From evening to morning implies this time, which is evening, morning, which is light. It implies fluctuating conditions of lesser and greater luminance. So you have everlasting, which implies higher than time, and then elements of time. For such is our mission in life. It is to impart the eternity and the perfection of the divine to a temporal world. And to do so not by annihilating the overwhelming, the world's temporality, the diversity, but by illuminating its very state and condition from evening to morning. So bring the everlasting, bring the infinite into the finite. That is the role that we have in illuminating this world. Not to transcend the world and find divine light, not to bask in divine light as it is above this world, but to bring the infinite into the finite elements of this world, of time and space. So that's the challenge, to bring the everlasting into the detail which represents the finite. Bring the infinite into the finite. Don't transcend the finite. That would be a wonderful spiritual pursuit. How do we meditate on a mountain beyond this world? Many religions inspired us to be able to transcend this world. That's not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is to bring the transcendent into this world. That which is infinite into the finite. The everlasting into the day, the morning and the evening, these different elements of time. And it had to be pure olive oil. Rashi explains from the Talmud that how do they produce this olive oil? They pressed the olive, and the first drop that came out of the olive was then accumulated from each of the olives until eventually there was enough pure olive oil to be able to make the lamp burn. So there's a few things we derive from this. Firstly, that the pressing of an olive produces the fine oil that brings about illumination. So says the Talmud, just as the olive yields light only when it is put through a process of pressure, so man's greatest potentials are realized only under the pressure of adversity. Why does life have so many challenges? What's the inner meaning of Hashem putting us through difficulties in this world? Not, God forbid, to have the experience of pain, and that in itself is the end. There is a point in bringing out a purity of self, a greater developed self, a more meaningful element of self by going through the process and the channel and the pressure of, just like the olive is pressed and produces the oil that has the illumination, ability to illuminate, Hashem sometimes puts us through the press, through the difficulty, in order to be able to bring out greater light in ourselves. That's how we should view the challenges of life. What can it bring out in me that would not have been discovered had I not been through this challenge? And there's a difference. The difference between the oil that was used for the menorah and the oil that was used in the meal offerings, which also needed oil, cooking oil. So we know that the first oil that was used for the menorah was the first drop that came out. There was no sediment. There was no even use of the sediment to produce the oil. After the first drop of oil was produced from the olive, they then put the rest of the olive into the press and completely pressed it. So that oil was the product of even the sediment. And that oil was less pure and was used for the meal offering. And the more mystical interpretation of this is that there's a difference between the oil that's needed for the menorah and the oil that was used for the meal offering. The menorah would represent the spiritual dimension, the educational dimension, the light of Torah. So if you want to have oil that will produce the spiritual dimension, it has to be of the highest form of purity. The oil that is used in the meal offering, which represents our physical needs, doesn't have to be as pure. Sometimes we're more caught up in ensuring that our life and the physical side is addressed with greater determination, effort, and energy and time than our spiritual. So it's telling us the recipe for the spiritual is the purest, the best, the first. Even in the day of education, the Rebbe was very, very concerned that in a day of a child, the first time of day is used for studying Torah, and later on, the secular studies and other studies that had to be done. But the first drop is for the spiritual, for the light of the menorah. The subsequent drops that come out of the rest, which is less pure and produced even by pressing the sediment, the entire olive produces the rest of the oil. That's for the physical, for the meal offerings. They should know that the spiritual dimension has to be much purer and produced by purity of a greater level than our physical. Crushed for the light, that is the wording in the verse. Kasis lama'oil, crush the olive for the light. So it was a Hasidic saying that one speaks crushing words of rebuke. Sometimes we say something, or the hour, the moment calls for rebuke, which is a form of crushing somebody, or saying something that touches a person very deeply and could be a painful experience. So what is the motivation? If ever you say a word that could bring pain to another yid, to another human being, what's the motivation? Kasis lamor, it has to be only for the sake of the light. It must be with the sole purpose of enlightening, illuminating, and uplifting one's fellow. Never, God forbid, to humiliate or to break him. So a strong word, firstly, as it says in Tanya, has to be only with a friend where you've invested and you have connected and the person trusts you. And therefore the word of rebuke is going to be well received rather than defensively rebutted. So the first thing is you have to actually have a relationship if you're going to say a harsh word. But if ever you say a harsh word, it is never cutting. It's never to hurt, to inflict pain. Never. A harsh word is only in the context of lama'or, to bring about light, illumination, positivity. And if there's any other motivation, you're probably not the right guy to do any crushing. That's how important it is. Okay, we're going on. We've got 10 minutes left. Let's talk about some of the other messages that we can take. This is the question that I began earlier to say that right at the end of this week's portion, we have one vessel that we would imagine should have been mentioned at the end of last week. Last week we spoke about the vessels. This week we speak, a little bit about the menorah, but mainly about the garments. And at the end of the garments, it almost looks like we remember, whoops, there's one more vessel that needs to be spoken about, the golden altar, not the one where you burnt the sacrifices, which was made of copper and stood outside of the holies, but the one that stood in the holies that was used to burn the incense. So the obvious question is, why is this in the portion of Tetzaveh with the clothing and not in the portion of Teruma, which talks about last week about the vessels, the kelim? Why is this at the end? So the answer that is given by the Rebbe is that there was something unique that was said about the service of the golden altar, where the incense was burnt. And that is, V'chol adam lo yeh, and no other person should be present when you bring the incense and the coals to burn it on top of the golden altar. V'chol adam lo yeh b'kodesh, no other human being may be in the holies when the Kohen performed the service. This duty is specifically singled out to be done in absolute privacy. Who was present? The Kohen and Hashem. And as a message, when it comes to all of the requirements of institutionalized religion, when to say and what to say and how to do and how to dress and how to fulfill all of the duties on a daily basis, the ultimate point, the final, the grand finale, the moment that sums it all up, the point that you reach at the end of all of that has to be, how do you function when nobody's around and nobody's watching? A private moment, a personal moment between you and Hashem. That becomes the ultimate goal of all of these different activities, and some of them were done with gold, and there was how it was perceived and how it was seen, and there was an aura of great beauty and dignity that everything about the last two portions, the vessels and the clothing, elicited and brought about. But in the final analysis, what is a spiritual moment? What is a godly moment? It's not how we are behaving in public, and it's not what we're doing on the bimah in shul. It's that personal, private moment when nobody else enters into. That there is no possibility of impression and making an impression and how one is read by others, but the most inner, private moment between ourselves and Hashem. That's what all of our religion ultimately is leading to make us honest, with integrity, with realness in our relationship, personal relationship with Hashem. And that's why this altar was put right at the end of all the vessels, and then at the end of all of the clothing, to say that the moment of burning the incense, no other human being was present. This was the private moment between an individual and Hashem, a magnificent moment of personal connection. And that all of us have to find. We have to keep our 613 commandments and Shabbos and Kashrus and Tefillin, and there's so many things that we have to do. But we always have to measure up at the end of everything. Where do I stand? When I say Shema at night, when nobody's watching, and I'm ending a day and it's me talking to God. That is the moment that gives expression to all of the details of our lives. How do we stand in a private moment before Hashem? And that's what comes right at the end, because this is the message. The culmination of the whole Mishkan is the Mizbeach HaZahav, this golden altar. The incense done in complete privacy. No other man shall be there. The ultimate moment of connection is a personal, private connection between ourselves and Hashem when we stand alone. And the final point that I want to share, which actually is a much bigger concept, which maybe we can build on next week, over the next weeks, and we still continue to talk about the sanctuary. Next week, we talk about the sin of the golden calf, amongst other things. And the following weeks, we talk about how the Jewish people actually built the sanctuary. So we have this last week and this week, the commandment. And then in 2 weeks' time and 3 weeks' time, we talk about how they actually fulfilled it. And it's more or less a complete repetition of all of the details of the sanctuary, the clothing and the vessels. So there'll be ample time to talk about there as well. And that is, and I'll just give the heads up, we're going to talk about the fact that the word for the wood, the name of the wood that they used, which is translated into English as acacia wood, is atzei shittim. And the word shittim, which means acacia wood, actually has very deep connotations, which represent the whole process of what the Mishkan was trying to accomplish in our lives. So I've mentioned the heading. We'll come back to it probably in 2 weeks' time to give this slide a lot more attention and time, because it's so significant in defining the whole purpose of the Mishkan. So that gives us a beautiful insight into this week's portion. I really thank everybody for joining and for being part of us. Thank you, Eula. Thank you, Joy, for joining. Aline. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Adelaide, Selden. Thank you. I hope you're feeling better, Selden. And push over to you. To Gerald, to Chava. Thank you. Peter, thank you for joining. Louis, thank you for joining. Philip, Eva, thank you for joining. I don't know if there's anyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a wonderful Shabbat. God bless.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.